Today I'm going to tell you about a true story. It's about the courage of 3 German teenagers during World War II who secretly disseminated forbidden outsider news about the war, Hitler, and the Nazi regime to their local community. Today's movie is Truth and Treason.
Do you really believe that Germany will lose this war?
Absolutely. Don't you?
I'm going to do spoilers early. 2 of the boys made it out alive, which is why we even have this history. The third boy, their intellectual leader and inspiration, did not.
Who was with you?
No one!
I'm going to give you a rundown of the movie, but I'll do more than that. I'm going to give you the words of one of the survivors as told by him in his book, 3 Against Hitler. Copies of this book were much cheaper back when I got it in 2020. If you try to buy it on Amazon now, you'll be paying between $60 to $70 for a new copy. I was lucky enough to learn about this historical account years ago, and it provided me with critical insight with which to evaluate the worldwide situation during 2020. Truth and Treason represents a real-life, deadly serious situation that actually happened. As such, I won't be doing my usual critique of the movie while making funny quips. Quips that usually only myself, my mother, my sister, one niece and one nephew, and perhaps one of my friends think are funny. For example, I won't get into how at the beginning the boys are talking in an extremely corny way that people only imagine boys in the 40s talk to each other, with an excessive use of the word pansy.
Pansy?
Go, jump you pansies! Jump pansies! Nobody calls my friend a pansy.
No, I won't talk about that. But I will talk about the movie, the history, and the conversation we all need to have with ourselves about what price we're willing to pay in pursuit of truth. So, let's get into Truth and Treason, a World War II story about the price for speaking out. Movie outline. At the beginning of the movie, we are introduced to Helmuth Hubener and his 3 friends, Rudi, Karl-Heinz, and Salomon. During their early years, they witnessed the rise of the Nazi regime in Germany, and naturally, that included their hometown in Hamburg. One of the boys, Salomon, was half Jewish. As Nazi power was absolute and under pressure from the state, even the boys' church started to exclude Jews. This caused great alarm to these particular youth, as this racial exclusion went against both the doctrine and the general attitude of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Salomon was ultimately taken by the SS and sent to the Auschwitz concentration camp. He did not survive. While Helmuth was before just disappointed by the behavior of his bishop, now he was devastated by the arrest and loss of his friend. So, driven by a desire to fight back against the totalitarian state and all that it stood for, Helmuth started distributing pamphlets and flyers secretly with the help of his friends Karl-Heinz and Rudi. Helmuth worked at the local city hall, one of the few people with access to literature forbidden to the rest of the country. So he borrowed passages from that stockpile of knowledge to amplify his messages to the German people. He wrote his own treatises on a variety of political topics, and with the help of a wide-range radio that could receive outsider broadcasts, Helmuth provided news about real developments in the war. See, what viewers have to understand is that Nazi Germany kept its own citizens ignorant of what really went on outside its borders. They told them what to believe about everything, and fabricated all kinds of victories and downplayed or misrepresented the losses. So as he was the brains of the operation, Helmuth wrote all the rebellious flyers, making dozens of copies using church equipment, and then he and his friends secretly distributed them around Hamburg by night. Eventually though, the boys do get caught. After months of harsh jail time, they were put on trial. Helmuth was sentenced to death. Rudi got 5 years in prison. Karl-Heinz got 10 years. Rudi and Karl-Heinz endured unbelievable hardship for years after that. They are the only reason we even know this history. I'm rushing a little bit through this summary because I want to share some of the gold nuggets we learned from 3 Against Hitler. Who Helmuth was. This is where the movie couldn't do him justice. Helmuth's character was even greater than what was shown, and the strength of his conviction to always do what was right came directly from his deep knowledge of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Helmuth was wise and intelligent, far beyond his years. Even as a young child, and while most of the German people were being swayed into loving the Nazis because they promised employment and temporary economic gains, Helmuth wasn't fooled. He understood what was happening better than the adults. When asked about how he felt about the Nazis, he told his friend, "Rudi, don't you ever believe what people are saying to you, especially in politics. They are always large in words, but small in actions. Only time will tell." He clouded his true feelings about the Nazi regime at a young age, understanding that he would have to in order to avoid persecution, and he never bought into the propaganda. Helmuth's obvious intellect earned him admission into middle school, something not given to just anyone, but he knew that university might be out of the question because only the children of very wealthy people were able to attend. It's important to understand that this youth Helmuth was so advanced at a young age that it sometimes drove his religious leaders a little crazy. I like the following passage. As my friendship with Helmuth grew, we started discussing the lessons we learned from the scriptures. Helmuth was not afraid to tackle the hard parts of the gospel and wasn't at all shy in challenging uninformed adults if they didn't know the doctrine well. Some adults even thought he was impertinent, but mostly Helmuth was just curious. It's true that he enjoyed rattling people's chains, just a little. He just wanted to wake them up and make sure that they were seeing all sides of a question. If Helmuth really wanted to, though, he could have demonstrated a dazzling display of intellectual fireworks that would have outdistanced even the most educated of the brethren. I include this because it gives us more insight into what a struggle Helmuth must have felt in his soul. This was a young man with such a keen insight into the gospel, and when he saw even some of his church leaders start to believe and push the Nazi propaganda, it must have been truly heartbreaking and disappointing to him. Nevertheless, Helmuth knew the doctrine, he knew what was right, and he continued in his efforts to fight against evil, even though he knew he'd be going against some members of his own faith. Did you ask yourself this question too? As I read 3 Against Hitler and watched Truth and Treason, I was forced to ask myself something. Do I know enough and have enough courage to stand up for what's right, even if my loved ones don't get it, even if it's dangerous? I'm guessing many of you listening to this are asking yourself something similar. And following that train of thought, we might also ask ourselves how Helmuth managed to do it. It's important to emphasize something here. Helmuth stood firm against tyranny not just because of his intelligence, but because he deeply understood and appreciated the gospel of Jesus Christ. He understood it so well that it overcame his fear of others, even the fear of being at odds with his own family and friends. The doctrine wasn't the problem. The problem was that those around him didn't understand it enough to stand firm in their convictions when faced with the terror of the Third Reich. They allowed fear to change them. And while I admit to being a judgy curmudgeon sometimes, I completely empathize with their situation. When your life is on the line, and your families, as well as everything else you know and hold dear, it's totally different than reading about it or watching it on a television screen. There are pressures that you and I do not understand. We haven't faced something like this. I don't condemn any of the German citizens back then who just didn't know how to fight back. It was an impossible situation. Intelligence without gospel doctrine. But let's go back to intelligence. There were lots of intelligent people within the Nazi regime, and many more that worked for them. And some members of the Third Reich came up with the most devilish and cruel ideas. So, we can conclude that intelligence without moral guidelines can result in calamity. Being smart isn't ever going to be enough to keep a person strong. True strength comes from being aligned with God's will and teachings because they are eternal, which makes him the very definition of strength. We do things his way and we are empowered. Rely on your own wit and eventually you'll trip over your own hubris. And there's gotta be 1,000,001 examples of that throughout history. The trial. To say that Helmuth and his friend's trial was overkill would be an understatement. It was presided over by justices of the Blood Tribunal, a nickname given to them because they wore blood-red robes and caps. Then there were the SA and SS officers, intimidating under any circumstance, and many important dignitaries. An overly daunting show of power and authority for the trial of a few young teenagers. As things moved along, it became clear that the whole affair was just a show trial. The defense lawyers did their job because they had to, but they already knew the outcome and didn't mount any kind of brilliant argument. It was decided beforehand that the boys would each receive the maximum punishment possible. Throughout the trial, Helmuth was questioned at length, and it became clear that he was the ringleader. And while the judges often lost their composure and screamed and ranted at him many times, Helmuth only became more clear and more confident. Rudi Wobbe believed that Helmuth was intentionally drawing attention to himself in order to divert the judge's anger away from his friends. Rudi described it in these words: "I think he sensed that this would be his last battle, and he was willing to sacrifice himself to protect us. In spite of my fear, I was thrilled to see him in action and felt great pride that he was my friend. It seems impossible, but here was a teenager winning a debate with learned lawyers and justices. If ever a man had a finest hour, this was Helmuth's." Here's where things diverge from the movie. The room wasn't full of spectators during the trial. Everyone, including the press, was made to leave so that no one could see what a sham it was. The judges didn't even leave the room to decide the verdict. They just put their heads together for a moment, sat back up, and said that they were ready for sentencing. Helmuth was 17 and underage, which should have been a point that offered him some protection. However, the judges and other officials wanted him dead so badly that they decided he was to be classified as an adult, so that he could receive an adult punishment. Their excuse for the classification was that Helmuth's intelligence level was well above average, and he had matured early. As such, he would receive the maximum sentence just like any adult that committed treason during wartime. the guillotine. The history of these young teenagers of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints from Hamburg who opposed the Third Reich is truly captivating. It shines a light on the intensity of the struggle to speak truth to power when danger and death is looking you right in the eyes. What would I have done? What would you have done? What's the right thing to do under circumstances like that? I'm not going to pretend to know the perfect answer. Most people are responsible for someone that is important to them. They have a responsibility to consider the well-being of their family, friends, or even a congregation. There are short-term dangers and long-term dangers. Though still an amazing thing, it's easier to be daring when your own life is on the line. There are brave people who are willing to self-sacrifice for a cause, but it's another thing entirely when you know that the bad guys will come after your family, friends, or church. That's pressure on a whole other level. I encourage you to watch Truth and Treason and read some of the books written about these events. It will give you more insight and perspective, and perhaps courage and hope, as you learn from people that have already lived through this kind of storm.